So I mentioned there's one more type of loop that I haven't talked about yet, and that's called a ForEach loop. So the reason I haven't talked about a ForEach loop is because we hadn't talked about arrays yet, and you sort of need an array or array list, some sort of data structure, in order to use a ForEach loop. So let's say this is our array that we have, an array of ints with these numbers in it. If I want to print out each of those numbers, I could create just a simple for loop, for where it says iterate over an array, or I can make a ForEach loop, which is down here. So if I click that, the way you read this is for each integer I in nums. So for every int value that's being stored in this array called nums, refer to it as I, and it's going to go through one by one. So instead of saying nums at I, this whole thing just becomes the variable I. So we can sys out I, just like that. So this is the same exact thing as saying for this sys out nums at I. This does the exact same thing, but it's a lot more concise, because we just say for every integer that's in this array, print out that integer. So to better illustrate this, I'm going to call this j instead. We're going to print out j, and then here I'm going to make an int variable called j, and I'm going to set it equal to nums at I. And then here I can just say sys out j. That's exactly what's happening when we use a ForEach loop. We're taking a variable that we call, for example, here we're calling it j. We're taking that variable and initializing it as some value in our array. Then we print out that value, because that's what I said to do here. We can also change what that value is. We can say something like j equals, or actually I'll say j times equals 2. So we're going to multiply all the values by 2. And then we'll print out whatever our values are to see what happens. Okay. So this is where you get more into the complex parts of Java. You might have noticed nothing happened to the numbers. None of them got changed. And that's because j is just a pointer. So you can think of it like when we say int j equals nums at I, it's like you're making a copy of your homework or something like that. You have some sheet of paper with a bunch of information on it that will say that that's nums at I. We're taking that information and we're copying it to another sheet of paper, and we're calling that j. If you modify j, nothing happens to I, or nums at I. Like if you made a copy of a piece of paper, if you start changing stuff on that second piece of paper, the first piece of paper doesn't change. That's what's happening here. So you do have to be a little bit careful when we're dealing with ForEach loops, mainly when we're dealing with primitive types. This is just something that happens with primitive types. Now, as far as non-primitives are concerned, we haven't talked about those yet, so just keep in mind that this is something you have to watch out for. So if you do want to modify values, you do still have to say nums at I times equals 2, and then sys out nums at I, just like that. And now all the values have been multiplied by 2. So keep that in mind when you're dealing with ForEach loops. They're not a complete end-all be-all for loops. There are still cases where you'll have to use a regular for loop, or even still a while or a do while. And there's even some cases where if you use a ForEach loop and you start modifying the array list in a specific way, it'll actually give you an error at runtime, and it'll say, hey, you can't modify this while you're iterating through it. But I'll get into that more when we start talking about array lists.